Every horrible thing that has happened to Guts in Berserk, explored. Kentaro Miura's Berserk is the definition of the phrase, and then things got worse. Every time you think things have calmed down and we're going to get a few moments of actual peace and quiet, an apostle jumps at you, or you're surrounded by scores upon scores of enemy knights. That's the reality that Berserk's protagonist, Guts, has to live through on a daily basis, and it really puts into perspective his epithet of being a struggler. We're not kidding when we say that Guts' life has been horrible since it began, and over the course of 16 prequel chapters and 371 canonical episodes, things have managed to only get worse. So of course, we're going to talk about it all in detail. This is every horrible thing that has happened to Guts in Berserk, explored. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. He was born from a hanging corpse. We told you we weren't kidding when we said his life has been horrible since it began. And if you wanted more proof, the first 6 chapters of the Black Swordsman arc should have sufficed. That manic rage and give no F's attitude of his, which made him put his life on the line in every fight, made us wonder what in the world could have happened to him to make him this unhinged. And then Miura hit us with the first Golden Age chapter. Up until that point, we'd been asking ourselves what exactly could have happened to Guts to make him so apathetic and, frankly, berserk. But then we realized his life had never really been normal since it began. The Golden Age Part 1 opens with a haunting shot of a lifeless tree. We know it's lifeless because the only leaves adorning its branches are carrion crows and hanging corpses. About a dozen bodies, in varying stages of decay, make for a grisly scene, even for the mercenary group that's passing by. But what really chills the blood is the child. Lying on the ground, cradled in the mire of blood and afterbirth, was a baby, whose body lay directly underneath one of the hanged corpses. Evidently, its mother had been executed with it inside of her, and just the fact that it even came out of her was disturbing enough for us. It was then that Shisu, a woman traveling with the mercenary band, decided to pick up the child and take it in, and this is where Guts' first rejection in life takes place. The leader of the band and Shisu's lover, Gambino, told her to leave the child and keep moving, as it was already dead. But as soon as Shisu dropped the baby, it started crying, stunning everyone gathered into disbelief. She picked him up immediately thereafter and started caring for it as if it were her own child. And we learn this is because Shisu had a miscarriage herself a few days ago, and her sanity was slipping as a result. Gambino didn't want anything to do with the situation, and thought that the kid would die most likely anyways, given the circumstances, but his comrades weren't so eager to turn a blind eye. Berserk is set in a period that mirrors the medieval era, and superstitions and such run rampant as a consequence. Some of the men think of Guts as an ill omen and don't want anything to do with him, but Gambino simply calls them cowards and carries onward. Because he is the leader of this particular mercenary band, the soldiers have no choice but to obey, but you can understand why we said his life was horrible from the beginning, right? We never see Guts' father, and we only see his mother's corpse. Guts himself was not showing any indication of being a living child until Shisu interacted with him, and even then, he was seen more as a cursed object than anything else. This perception would follow him around the rest of his time with the mercenary band, and as you might have guessed, it didn't do him any favors growing up. But to be fair, neither did the environment he grew up in. Guts grew up in a mercenary camp. If you're one of those people who think that the life of a mercenary is all girls and glory, then you clearly haven't paid attention to real life as much as you should have. In truth, the life of a mercenary is about as ugly as the work that they do. And yes, the Band of the Falcon doesn't count as a realistic mercenary band. What does is the one that ended up raising Guts, because in a true mercenary band, all that a man looks out for is their purse and their necks. The first 3 years of Guts' life were relatively fine, if you consider being raised in the middle of field camps and bloody battles, fine. But at the age of 3, Guts lost his adopted mother to the plague, and things would only get worse from there. His stepdad, Gambino, wasn't present to attend to Shisu in her last moments, as he was too busy fighting in a siege. So Guts was the one who held Shisu's hand and comforted her in her agony. After that, it was a life of hard labor and training for him. At 6 years old, Gambino was dragging Guts into the action as a squire, and training him how to fight adults on the field. By the time he was 9, Guts was ready to take part in his first battle, battle. And while that sounds like a great thing, he was fighting not because he loved it, but because Gambino wanted him to work his debt off. As a result, Guts knew how to cook, clean, sew, and basically perform every duty expected of a soldier before he had even hit puberty. The hardships of living in a mercenary band were plenty, and Guts faced all of them over the course of his association with Gambino. But there was one thing that stood out head and shoulders above the rest. He was assaulted as a child and developed PTSD thereafter. The night of Guts' first battle, he was lying in bed and shivering out of fear as always. He didn't have his sword in his hands, you see, and it was Guts' ritual to go to bed clutching his sword as if his life depended on it. Had he kept his sword handy, things might have played out a little differently that night. After retiring for the day, Guts' tent was approached by one of his mercenary comrades named Donovan. At first, Guts was confused as to why this man would have come to see him this late at night, but his intentions became very clear when he started trying to overpower Guts. He fought back, but it was in vain. A 9-year-old boy could never hope to completely resist the physical strength of an adult man, but that wasn't what broke Guts. What broke him was Donovan's claim that Gambino sold him out for a mere 3 silver coins. Guts couldn't believe that his stepfather would do such a thing, and went into shock as Donovan proceeded to assault him. The next morning, he planned to confront Gambino, sword in hand, but when the latter behaved as if he didn't know anything about it, he reassessed his own motives. Guts managed to get revenge on Donovan in the very next battle his band was involved with, but it didn't matter, he had been scarred already. This incident would cause him to develop severe PTSD in his early life, which manifested as a hatred of being touched. For many years, Guts would lash out at anyone, man, woman, or otherwise, that tried to grab him without consent. It was only after he met the love of his life that he could let go of this trauma, but that wouldn't come for nearly a decade after this incident. But just because Guts thought Gambino didn't sell him out, doesn't mean that was the truth, because Guts was forced to kill his own stepfather. As we were reading through the first couple of Golden Age chapters, our impression of Gambino was that he is a hard man who believes in tough luck and surviving through strength. His abandonment of Shisu was hard to digest, and so was the treatment he gave Guts during the first 9 years of his life. But Gambino would always preface his actions by claiming that the boy had to learn how to fight if he wanted to live the life of a mercenary. When he was training Guts at 6 years old, Gambino went overboard and slashed the boy across his nose. The wound cut to the bone and left a scar that Guts sports till this day. But later, Gambino ended up giving him some medicine, which Guts took as a fatherly gesture. 3 years later, after his first fight as a mercenary, Guts gave Gambino his earnings from the fight and received a coin in return for his efforts, which made his face light up because to him, this was acknowledgement. But then Gambino lost his leg during a particularly harrowing siege and was displaced as the leader of the band, and this is where the ugly truth started to emerge. 2 years after having his leg blown off, Gambino was an invalid who dedicated more time to his dog than to the boy he supposedly raised like a son. When Guts returned from a battle having slain the enemy general, all Gambino could think of was buying more meat for his pet, and he even struck Guts with his crutch for stalling. The young man was bothered by this, but tried to brush it off later in the night because he didn't want to assume things. So you can imagine just how heartbroken he was when his assumptions were proven right by Gambino's actions. The former mercenary band leader stumbled into Guts' tent, drunk off his rocker, and tried to kill him. Had Guts not been training day in and day out, Berserk might have ended before it ever got off the ground. In his drunken rage, Gambino ended up confessing that he had always hated Guts and that he blamed him for Shisu's death. He admitted that he did, in fact, sell him out to Donovan, and when a tearful Guts asked him why, Gambino answered with the same assertion his men had made about the boy all those years ago. He venomously told Guts that he'd wished he'd died underneath his mother's corpse all those years ago before making one final lunge at him. Even in that fractured state of mind, Guts listened to Gambino's lessons about sword fighting as he instinctively sidestepped the charge and hit his stepdad with a fatal counter. Even though he was justified in defending himself, he would never quite forgive himself for taking the life of the man who he thought was his father. Even after joining the Band of the Falcon, Guts would often think of Gambino as the father he killed, not the man who treated him worse than a dog. He'd even have nightmares about the night the deed occurred, and it makes sense why. At the age of 11, Guts became a kinslayer, though Gambino never treated him like a father would, and this wasn't missed by his mercenary comrades because Guts was chased down like a dog by his own mercenary group. When Guts inadvertently took his father's life, he also set his own tent aflame, which drew the attention of his mercenary comrades. Now, For context, these guys were the same people who were telling Gambino to lay off Guts when he was training the boy precisely because he was a boy. These were the same guys who mocked Gambino for his disability and refused to take him on in a fight out of either fear or cowardice. But now that they saw him lying in a pool of his own blood and Guts clutching the sword that did him in, suddenly they were filled with a sense of camaraderie. The mercenaries attacked Guts and the boy instinctively cut his way through them, making the tent collapse on his way out. He cut a horse loose and took off into the starry night, all the while questioning why any of this was happening to him. But his former brothers-in-arms had drawn their own conclusions. They called Guts a thankless, cursed child who ripped off the arm that fed him and brought ill luck upon all of them. The mercs chased him down like a dog and shot multiple arrows in his direction. One of them took Guts in the arm and he fell off a cliff, but this didn't satisfy his pursuers. They wanted to finish the job themselves so Gambino's soul could rest in peace. But we as the readers can see through the hypocrisy of this statement. Under normal circumstances, that kind of fall would kill anyone, and Guts was an unarmored 11-year-old kid when he fell, yet he survived somehow. He wished to die as soon as he could, but his body moved on its own accord. He was soon set upon by a pack of wolves, and once again he thought this was the end for him. But once again, his body betrayed his emotions and defended itself. Guts passed out due to exhaustion and blood loss, but the fact that he was just forced to kill his father in self-defense and flee from the men he'd literally grown up with likely also played a role in it. He was eventually found by another mercenary group who decided to take him in, but this time, Guts didn't make the mistake of cozying up to any of them. He had experienced firsthand just how ugly and depraved the world of a mercenary was, and now he braced himself for a lifetime of death and treachery. It would be the latter that ends up finding him first. Guts was once sold out by an older merc and ended up imprisoned. Guts getting struck by an arrow and shaking it off like you would an antbite is something of a recurring theme in his life. But unlike his days as the Black Swordsman, shaking off a wound like that in his youth was far more difficult, and this is what made him drop his guard this one time he was captured by his enemies. Walking towards the enemy castle as a prisoner, Guts met an older merc called Martino, who showed him a level of kindness he hadn't seen in a while. The old man spoke to Guts of his life and addressed his wounds, and even gave him a shoulder for support. He also managed to pick the locks off his bonds and encouraged him to run to his freedom, as he was the only one young enough to do so. But in hindsight, Guts should have known he was being used as bait. As soon as he rushed down the hill, he was riddled with arrows, and Martino used the distraction to escape himself. Guts was thrown into the castle dungeon, and he reprimanded himself for being sentimental in a world that treats emotion like a weakness. Before escaping, he actually told Martino that he would repay him someday, and as he lay dying in his cell, he recalled a lesson from Gambino. One time, Gambino used Guts as bait during an ambush, and taught him that to live as a mercenary, he had to do 3 things. Number 1, develop his brain. Number 2, develop his skills. And number 3, trust no one besides himself, not even his father. This story has a slightly happier ending because eventually Guts was treated by a flower spirit called Chich and saved from death by a returning Martino. But the fact that he was taken advantage of in the first place, that too, in a literal moment of weakness, is what likely made him throw his guard all the way up when he met his future comrades for the first time. Well, that and the fact that they tried to kill him. Guts was nearly killed by his future comrades. Though Martino had tricked Guts into becoming bait, he did leave the swordsman with some words of wisdom. Martino claimed that even though Guts followed the path of the mercenary, someday he would find a group of brothers-in-arms with whom he would be able to share his pain and joy. Though Guts dismissed it as the words of a trickster at the time, he would go on to find those brothers-in-arms later that same year when he joined the Band of the Falcon. Yet, even there, he'd have to introduce himself sword first, and what makes it worse is the fact that originally the Falcons intended to kill him. Guts' first encounter with the band was during the siege where he slayed the Grey Knight Bazuso. He didn't realize it at the time, but his performance was being observed by the higher-ups of the Band of the Falcon, and when he went off on his own path after the end of said siege, he was set upon by one of those observers, who intended to rob him blind of his riches and glory. Guts ended up in a 4-on-1 situation in his second encounter with the Band of the Falcon, but these guys were clearly underlings because he cut down one of them and left a second armless in the blink of an eye. Things picked up when he crossed swords with his future waifu, Kaskas Kaskas, as she was the second best fighter in the band and clearly had the skills to back it up. Guts used his overwhelming strength and skill to corner even Kaskas, but at that moment, his defeat was guaranteed, because that's when Griffith rode onto the field. The White Falcon effortlessly defeated the frenzied Guts with literally 2 moves, and the second one was a piercing strike that nearly stabbed his heart. He would end up spending half a week recovering from his injuries, and when he did wake up, Kaskas punched him in his stab wound almost immediately. This was Guts' introduction to the people who would go on to become his family for the foreseeable future, and you can say it's a dog's world when it comes to the mercenary game, but if you also know Quercus, you know this entry is justified. Nosferatu Zod. For the first 3 years that he spent with the Band of the Falcon, Guts was practically invincible. Using a combination of his inhuman physical durability and his insane battle IQ, he had won them more battles than he could count, and even made friends amongst their ranks. Guts was the guy who would charge into an enemy battle line all by himself and come out alive, only to do it all over again. This is how he had risen through the ranks and became the Raider captain of the Band of the Falcon, but none of his strength or skill helped him when he came face to face with Nosferatu Zod for the first time. While Zod was in his human form, Guts could at least keep up with him, though he did remark that his opponent's strength was inhuman. Things got horrific when Zod, grasped by the fervent heat of the battle, transformed into his apostle state and renewed his attack on Guts. The Raider captain couldn't even believe that a monster like him existed, let alone put up a fight. Though Guts didn't let go of his sword during his fight with Zod, he was thrashed about like an infant, and the only reason he's still alive is because Griffith intervened at the right time. Zod would have torn him apart if the White Falcon hadn't arrived with reinforcements, and working together, Guts and Griffith did manage to force him back for an instant, but that was it. Zod simply lashed at Griffith with his tail and pinned Guts down with his severed arm before moving in for the kill. If he hadn't noticed Griffith's crimson behelit, he would have killed them both on the spot, and even his departure came with an ominous prophecy. Guts would end up holding on to this encounter for a good while, because he had never faced anything like the Immortal One before. When the Skull Knight shows up to speak with him for the first time, Guts had a flashback to his fight with Zod, and he immediately becomes apprehensive of this inhuman presence. In fact, his year-long peregrination after leaving the Band of the Falcon was motivated solely by this encounter, as Guts sought to strengthen his arm and perfect the way of the sword. He would go on to fight Zod 2 more times, and even work alongside him on one occasion, but it seems like these two are destined to fight each other, until one of them finally dies. The scary thing is, it is becoming increasingly more likely that that one will be Guts, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Maybe Guts can defeat an entity revered as a battlefield god for 300 years for good during their proper rubber match. After all, he did attain a considerable degree of Zod-like savagery on the field, albeit this was even before his black swordsman days, and also, it wasn't out of choice. Guts was once forced to defend himself against 100 Tudor knights. This is what we meant when we said it wasn't by choice. During the penultimate battle of the 100-Year War between Tudor and Midland, Guts was forced to defend himself against 100 Tudor knights, led by the goofball Adon Cobberwaltz, and he had to do it all while protecting Kaskas. After rescuing Kaskas from a potentially fatal fall off a cliff, Guts helps nurse her back to health and listens to her life story, bonding with her properly for the first time in the process. During their conversation, they were spotted by trackers sent out by the Tudor commander, who set up an ambush. Guts and Kaskas managed to hold their own pretty well initially, but it became clear soon enough that the latter was in no shape for an extended battle. Guts convinced Kaskas to leave and braced himself for the fight of his life, because no matter how you slice it, going up against 100 enemies is a steep uphill task. The only other person we know of who had taken out that many enemies in a single fight was Bazuso, and he only accomplished about 30% of what Guts managed to do that night. That's right, the Raider captain of the Band of the Falcon killed 100 men all by himself, but the effects of such an ordeal were obvious. The Band of the Falcon's physician basically ruled him out of action for the rest of the campaign, and if it wasn't for Guts' uncanny durability, that ruling would have held. He was covered from head to toe with bandages, and the only reason he managed to heal up as quickly as he did was because Judo hooked him up with some elf dust. Thereafter, the legend of the 100-man slayer spread throughout the continent of man, but no one knows just how close to death he came in order to realize that legend. Not even his #1 fanboy, Isidro. The Eclipse. This entry could easily be a video by itself because the Eclipse is one of the most infamous sacrilegious rituals depicted on the pages of any manga ever. When Guts defeated Griffith in a battle for his own freedom a little over a year before this event, he had no clue that the man he so admired would fall from grace so rapidly and brutally. And yet that is exactly what happened. Zod's prophecy from their first encounter came true when, after being exposed by Wild, Griffith ended up activating his Behelit and kickstarting the infernal feast known as the Eclipse. Guts had faced only 2 apostles in his life up until this point, and one of them had been a pitiful draw. Now, he was faced by a seemingly endless horde of them, and to make matters worse, it was all because of Griffith that they were here in the first place. Initially, Guts refused to accept the fact that the man who had inspired him to cut his own path through life could stoop so low as to sacrificing his comrades for more power. But when Griffith was encased in the womb of darkness, and the Band of the Falcon was branded by Void, he knew that he had misjudged Griffith's character. The nightmare that followed was masterfully depicted by Miura-sensei across 4 chapters, and, to be honest, words cannot do justice to the horrors that Guts endured. You need to go out of your way and read chapters 70 through 88 of the manga, or watch the last couple episodes of the 1997 anime to really understand just how traumatic this event was for everyone involved. Let's just say that if we were there, we'd have become what Kaskas became after the Eclipse, and that's just what would have happened through observation. And speaking of what happened to Kaskas, Guts was forced to watch his lover be violated by the man he thought was his best friend. His whole life, Guts had only ever received transactional love. With Gambino, he was looked after as long as he was bringing in the money to put food on the table. With Godot and Erica, he was happy as long as they let him train and kept him in one piece. Things started to change when he fell in love with Kaskas because there, he found reciprocation for the first time. Even with Griffith, Guts was happy as long as he could swing his sword for the sake of realizing the White Falcon's dream. So when that White Falcon was reborn as the Wings of Darkness, Femto, Guts couldn't digest the fact that this was the same man who had once saved his beloved from a horrific fate, the very same fate he was himself subjecting her to now. Griffith, having cast aside his humanity and joining the ranks of demonkind as Femto, sought to establish his dominance over Guts. In his mind, the day Guts left was the day his dream died, and every agony he had suffered after that was because of him. So how does he reclaim his own narrative? By violating the woman he once saved from sexual assault. The defilement of Kaskas is the most heart-wrenching scene in the entire manga, and what makes it worse isn't just the fact that Griffith is the one doing it, it's also the fact that he forces Guts to watch. The Black Swordsman hacks his own arm off to try to save Kaskas from the monster their shared idol had become, but is immediately restrained by 3 more apostles, who also put his right eye out for good measure. Guts is broken physically, mentally, and emotionally by the time Femto is done committing his first sacrilegious act as a god hand, and it's an understatement to say that his life was never the same after. Literally every night of Guts' life after the Eclipse. The brand of sacrifice is a powerful astral marking that is seared into the flesh of an offering with a singular purpose, to sacrifice them to evil. Usually when a human being ascends to apostlhood or becomes a God Hand member, the branded ones are immediately sacrificed via apostle consumption. But in the case of Guts and Kaskas, they were saved by Skull Knight just as the Eclipse was about to end. And this is unprecedented. Even Zod was shocked that Guts managed to get out of that hellscape alive and mostly in one piece, but he knew just how much worse his life was going to get from here on out. Zod dared the branded swordsman to show him how he would survive as no more than a man trudging through hell, because that's effectively what Guts' life was going to be. The brand of sacrifice placed both Guts and Kaskas within the interstice, where they were more susceptible to being exposed to malign spirits and entities that would kill murder them in an instant. Though there are things that can avert its effects, like the elfin magic surrounding Godot's mind, Guts was not in a mental state to sit back and relax in a cave. He was thirsting for demon blood, and he decided to use the brand to his advantage. Using it as a sort of homing device, he began hunting down apostles one after the other, and over the course of 2 years, he had killed scores, if not hundreds of them. But it came at a considerable price. The Black Swordsman arc opens with Guts at the peak of his apostle hunting days, and to say he's scarier than the demons he fights daily is an understatement. You really get an idea of the daily agony that is Guts' life post-Eclipse when he has his first encounter with Rosine. Though he manages to survive survive being blitzed at the speed of sound, Rosine manages to poison him. The interstice isn't exactly kind to poison folks just because they're already injured, and as night approached, so did the bane of Guts' existence. He was forced to skin and eat a snake as well as some cocoa leaves in order to simply get through the night, and if he hadn't met Puck by this point in his life, there's no telling how much longer he could carry on with reckless abandon. But to be completely square with you, we understand where all that rage and berserker fury comes from because Guts was rendered helpless in the face of Kaskas' mental break. The woman Guts fell in love with and the woman he had spent most of Berserk protecting are, sadly, two different people. Before the Eclipse, Kaska was a fierce female warrior who was not afraid to speak her mind and teach her peers a lesson or two. After the Eclipse, she became a literal shell of herself. Femto's unspeakable acts and the horrors she witnessed during that infernal feast broke her mind and regressed her into a childlike state, and this was perhaps the sharpest knife twisting in Guts' guts. When he woke up after being rescued by Skull Knight, he immediately sought out Kaska and didn't understand why she was acting so weirdly at first. Then the reality of the situation sunk in, and Guts was forced to reconcile with the fact that Kaska may never be the same again. The pain this causes him is obvious. You just need to see any panel depicting Guts' journey with Kaska to know that he is heartbroken by her current situation. But what makes things worse is his inner beast of darkness. Guts has a lot of violent emotions simmering inside of him ever since the Eclipse happened, and understandably so. But these emotions and his constant sleepless battle with demonkind had pushed him to his limits and caused his malice to take on a life of its own. Guts longed to be with Kaska the way he had been with her during the Wounds chapters, but he knows just how wrong that would be right now. Yet his beast of darkness very nearly compelled him to do the same things to Kaska that Griffith did, and possibly worse. This was the entire reason that he even accepted taking on companions in the first place. He was worried what he himself might end up doing to Kaska now that she was practically defenseless. There are a lot of tragic, disturbing feelings running between these two characters throughout Berserk, but it's taken to the next level when Kaska's mind breaks. Guts' complex and tragic encounters with children. It seems like every time Guts encounters a child, something horrific is bound to go down. Ever since his Black Swordsman days, Guts' relationship with children has been drowned in tragic irony. We see this first with the girl Colette, whose father offered Guts a ride in his wagon when he was departing Coca City. His brand ended up attracting many malign dead spirits to the wagon, and one of them possessed Colette, who ended up killing her own father. Guts was forced to kill her in self-defense, but that didn't stop him from throwing up in disgust of his actions. Miura doubled down on this tragic fate of encounters in the next chapter by introducing Teresia and making Guts the object of her ire. The Black Swordsman had killed the Slug Count and saved Teresia from the same fate as him, but to her, he killed her dad, and for that she could never forgive him. Guts brazenly challenged her to come at him, but the last look we see on his face before transitioning to the Golden Age is an expression of despair. He picks up a habit of using kids as hostages and decoys in his apostle hunts, but he does his damn best to ensure they don't die on his account. It doesn't stop the children from suffering terrible fates, however, and Guts is very aware of this. His relationship with his own child is traumatic enough, because how can he raise a kid that has the same demon's blood who defiled his mother? Really, the only child to have not faced any tragedy directly because of Guts in the story is Erica, and even that is arguable. Shirke and Decidro don't count in our minds because, number one, they aren't floating side characters, they are core members of the Black Swordsman party, and Decidro is a teenager, if we aren't mistaken, and number two, they're clearly being set up for some great tragedy down the line, and we don't mind being correct even in retrospect. That time, Slan hurt Guts in Clip-Off. Guts has had a lot of insane near-fatal injuries that would have killed normal people thousands of times over, but those were all physical. There is no way for him, as a human, to defend against an attack to his astral body, and that's exactly where Slan hit him. When Guts entered Clip-Off to rescue Kaska and Farnese, he ended up encountering the only female God Hand member who had manifested there just to see him. To say that he was being toyed with is an understatement. Slan effortlessly ripped off his armor and restrained him like he was a child. Makes sense given how much she calls him a boy, but we're digressing. She then slashes his chest with her manifested body, and although Skull Knight eventually helps Guts defeat her, the gash remains long after this fight. After noticing Guts' injuries, Shirke notes just how inhuman it was that he was even walking, because getting an injury on your astral body was like getting an injury on your soul. The sheer pain is mind-numbing, almost as bad as the pain that flares through the brand of sacrifice when it's in the presence of a God Hand. Though Guts soldiered on despite being in that much pain, his injuries eventually caught up with him to the point where the only thing that could keep him going was the Berserker Armor. And if you know anything about this series, you know just how big of a red flag that is, because everything involving the Berserker Armor. The Berserker Armor is both the greatest and the worst weapon in Guts' arsenal. When he dons it, its malignant ode takes away the physical sensation of pain and unleashes the maximum physical potential of his body. It also fills him with the only thoughts necessary in a life or death battle, and can even fix his injuries mid-fight. This turns Guts into an even fiercer warrior than he already was, and he starts one-hand wielding Dragon Slayer and cracking the world's third hardest substance as if it were mere concrete. But the cons of using this armor easily outweigh its pros, as you would know if you've seen our video on the Berserker Armor. To give you the gist, the armor literally consumes its wearer's body and psyche. The Berserker Armor doesn't heal injuries, it just negates the sensation of pain and pierces through the wearer's flesh to fix their bones in a pinch. The man who wears the armor can easily bleed out whilst fighting with the armor on if he isn't aware of his own ego at all times, and that becomes impossible without the presence of a strong magic user, at least in Guts' case. Also, the Berserker Armor induces such a violent storm of emotions in a person's mind that they lose sight of who is friend and foe, and makes them liable to savagely killing their own allies. On 2 separate occasions, Guts nearly lost his mind and attacked his friends, and it took both Shirke and the Moonlight Boy to pull him out of it. And to top it all off, the Berserker Armor has started to take away Guts' natural strength and skill. As of this moment in the manga, the Black Swordsman is losing vision in his one good eye. His nerves have been affected to the point he can't hold Dragon Slayer for too long without the armor on, and he stopped tasting food a long time ago. Heck, his body looks like it is shriveled up since he got the armor, and to top it all off, Guts might be addicted to it. Losing his physical senses means he can't swing Dragon Slayer around like he could before he got the armor, which only increases his dependency on it. And, well, for an object that has literally taken chunks out of his body, given him a salt and pepper streak, and gotten his friends nearly killed twice, we don't know if depending on the Berserker Armor is what Guts needs right now. This holds especially true given where he is in the manga right now, because his despair is food for his beast of darkness that is just waiting to pounce on him from deep within the recesses of his mind. And when he does eventually lose all self-control, it will be unlike all the horrors the armor has already made him struggle through. Guts versus the Sea God. This entry might confuse a few people, but hear us out. The Sea God was perhaps Guts' toughest fight, and one where even the Berserker Armor couldn't help him out. Things were fine and dandy as long as Guts was outside the Sea God's body, because all he had to deal with were its pesky tentacle whiskers. Once inside, it was a whole different ballgame, because now he had to contend with the monsters living within the Sea God. He managed to kill an indefinite number of parasites, avoid ship-melting stomach acid, and reach his objective with relative ease. But once he got there, things got real bad real quick. See, Guts' logic was simple. If the Sea God was an organic being, then the quickest way to kill it would be to take out its heart. Only its heart was a 12-foot tall, eye-bespeckled monstrosity whose thumping literally made Guts temporarily blind. We're not kidding. Go read the chapters where he fights the Sea God and you'll understand why this is a big deal. Usually, Guts can pretty much overpower and outsmart any opponent on the field of battle unless they are a literal divine being. The Berserker Armor only amplified his potential to become a god killer, but it only enhanced his physical traits. It did nothing to protect his senses, and the Sea God's heartbeat was so strong that it literally shut down Guts' nervous system. He couldn't walk, hear, see, or feel anything as he closed in on the thing, and in the end, it took a blind gambit to bring down the malevolent deity of the sea. With none of his senses working, Guts relied on thought transferences and Shirke's guidance to pierce the Sea God's heart, and in the aftermath, he couldn't move to save his own life. It took Muro's and the Moonlight Boy's astral projection to save Guts from a watery death, and to say that this battle could have easily gone sideways for the Black Swordsman feels trivial now, but was very real when the chapter first came out. He remained the source of Kaskas PTSD even after she went through the Corridor of Dreams. One of the only things motivating Guts to continue on his journey and put his vengeance aside was the fact that Kaska would be safe at Elfhelm. When Skull Knight told him that her sanity could also be restored by the island's ruler, it only reinforced his faith in his mission, but what he should have clung to was the Wandering Wraith's warning. Though Skull Knight did give Guts a ray of hope, he also prefaced it by saying that there was no guarantee it would work. work, and even if it did, his wish could differ vastly from Kaskas. That's exactly what happened when the latter was taken to the Corridor of Dreams. Though Kaskas' mind was restored to its state before the eclipse, everything that happened during it lingered in her subconscious. Every time Kaska would try to think about what happened after she left to save Griffith, she would suffer a massive panic attack, and it only got worse when she saw Guts. To Kaska, Guts was a representation of everything that came with the eclipse. Whenever she saw him, she'd get visions of apostles and dying falcons which would send her into a state of shock. Farnace had promised her she would be able to see Guts soon when she was in her dreamscape, but the reality is, it doesn't look like Guts and Kaska will ever be reunited the way we want them to. And this eats Guts alive. He traveled all the way to Elfhelm, fending off apostles and godlike monsters just to see Kaska return. And now that she was here, she couldn't even bear to look at him, and it only broke his heart even further. The look of utter despair and hopelessness that Guts has on his face when he realizes he can't even get close to Kaska to help her out is one of the saddest things in all of Berserk, and it doesn't look like it's going to get better anytime soon. Guts couldn't land a single blow on Griffith in Elfhelm. This might seem like a small thing to you, but to Guts, it's everything. Throughout his lifetime, first as a mercenary, then as a raider captain, and now as the Black Swordsman, the one thing that was a reassuring constant for Guts was his skill with a sword. Since a very young age, he had a habit of hugging his sword before going to bed, and even when he would reach his limits, the one thing he would never let go of willingly was his weapon. The sword was as much a part of his body as his arm, and when he swung it, Guts had total confidence in himself. It was the only thing that he knew how to do perfectly, and so imagine the horror on his face when he realizes that the one thing he does best is useless against his greatest enemy. Well, you don't have to, because that's exactly what happens in chapters 365-369. After the Moonlight Boy turns back into Griffith, the first thing Guts does is leap at him with Dragon Slayer. But to his shock, and ours as readers, none of his sword swings even touch the Falcon of Light. Keep in mind that this is the first time we've seen Griffith in a direct physical confrontation with a human since he got pimp-slapped by Rickard in chapter 337, and so we had completely forgotten about the fact that during his attack on Shet, he phased through multiple arrow volleys as if he was intangible. Guts' relentless assault on Griffith started out hopeful, but with every consecutive swing he realized what was wrong. His attacks weren't connecting. He must have tried to slash through Griffith from a dozen angles half 100 times, but it was all to no avail. Guts, the Black Swordsman whose Dragon Slayer had cut through so many evil beings that it could now injure God Hand members, couldn't hit the very object of his ire a single time, and it broke him. Guts losing faith in his fighting abilities is a scary thought, but not as scary as it being combined with his literal soul sinking into despair, because Griffith kidnapped Kaska right after she had regained her sanity, and all Guts could do was watch. The reason why Griffith came to Elfhelm was twofold. Number one, he wanted to get rid of all magical opposition to him in Fantasia, and number two, he wanted to ensure that no one held power over him because of his monthly transformations into the Moonlight Boy. The former was easy to accomplish. Griffith came strapped with his war demons. The latter is what he directly involved himself with, and it was this, combined with the fact that he couldn't land a single blow on Griffith, that threw Guts into a spiral of despair. When he saw just how helpless his sword was in the face of this God Hand member, and that he kidnapped Kaska so easily, Guts lets go of Dragon Slayer. This is huge, because not once in the series has he let go of his sword willingly. Yes, there is that time he dropped it while training at Elfhelm, but that was because of the side effects of the Berserker Armor. When Guts saw Kaska's motionless body in Griffith's arms, and then witnessed Griffith departing the scene on Zod's arm, it took away every reason he had to live and fight for. For the first time in the entire manga, we see Guts have a proper mental breakdown, and not the Berserk kind either. When he's brought to Roderick's ship in the aftermath of the destruction of Elfhelm, Morta tells Shirke to go check up on him because he was mumbling to himself and seemed pretty out of it. Their main concern was Guts going berserk, of course, but when Shirke tried to reach out to him, he repelled her advance. Guts sank into his grief and despair at losing Kaska completely, breaking down in tears and screaming, "It was all for nothing," over and over again. It's a jarring tonal shift from the guy who used to always preach about making it through life off one's own strength and look down on people who couldn't even stand and fight for what they believed in. He had worked too hard and lost too much in even getting to Elfhelm, all because he wanted Kaska back. When she got better but still had PTSD, Guts made his peace with it so long as she was safe and acting like herself again. But when Griffith took her from him once again, he felt like his entire life up until that point had been, well, pointless. As of this moment, the seahorse is under threat of being engulfed by a whirlpool that also swallowed Elfhelm. But all that might not matter at all if Guts ends up going berserk. This time, no one will be able to stop him because he doesn't have the thing that usually restrains his berserker approach. Without Kaska, there's no telling how far Guts' sanity will slip or how quickly. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the true horror that awaits us on the other side. We haven't gotten a Berserk chapter in the last 4 months, and we're not sure if we want another, because that means coming face to face with a Guts at his lowest and a Griffith at his highest. And both of these things fill us with despair, but for obviously different reasons. Marvelous verdict. And that's it for this one. To say that Guts is one of manga's most tortured protagonists is an understatement. As we've shown you today, his life has been a living hell since it began, and it's also destined to end in Berserk's version of hell. Remember that Guts is branded. His life has already been forfeit to demonkind from his last breath to the last drop of blood that runs through his veins. He's called the Struggler because he's constantly defying causality with every step he takes and every swing of his sword. But right now, it looks like all of that might have been for nothing. It will be very intriguing to see where Kujimori takes the story from here, because Berserk is entering its final stages, and we're sure this list will double in size by the time it ends, if it ever actually does. Until then, let us know what you think was the most horrific thing that's happened to Guts, or if we've missed out on something in the comments section down below. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.